Hello, my friends and fellow music lovers. I'm Clyde Mitchell, the conductor of Lionsgate Sinfonia, based right here on the beautiful North Shore of Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I promised you some fun little talks on some of my favorite subjects, and for this episode of Clyde Chats, I'd love to share with you my ever-changing top 10 list of favorite classical music. I'll list the pieces of music, give a reason or two about what I like about them, and suggest an easily accessed recording. I like to listen to several different performances when I'm studying a piece that Sinfonia will be presenting, and I usually have multiples of each of these works so I can hear how great conductors of the past feel about various aspects of performance, such as the tempo, the speed of a piece, balance among the instruments, how large of a string section to use, etc. Almost any recording of these great masterworks will do. You can look on YouTube, you can do your streaming online for whatever service you use, you can check out CDs from a public library, you can support your local record store. However you do it, I hope you find what will become your favorite. Now, I hate starting off this way, calling these great symphonic pieces classical music, because many of my favorites were not composed during the actual classical period. Sure, many works by Vivaldi, Bach, Handel, Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, Beethoven, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Stravinsky, Gershwin, and John Williams all figure prominently in my CD collection, but the specific classical period is the period in music that was mostly from the early 1700s to the late 1700s, early 1800s. Think of this standard life of the great Papa Haydn. It's Franz Joseph Haydn's life from 1732 to 1809, which really depicts the classical period. He was the father of the symphony. Before and after the classical period, we had medieval or Baroque music, followed by Romantic, Impressionistic, 20th century, and present-day modern and popular music. Okay, yes, for our purposes, we can call all of these pieces classical, but to be clear, there are several very important and distinctive periods of music and art. Okay, with that out of the way, here's my most up-to-date list of my top 10 favorite pieces of, I'm going to say it, classical music. One caveat for my choices, which I'm sure many of you could already guess, our favorites will change as our lives change. One day, my number one piece might be Vivaldi's Four Seasons, and then after my best friend's pet bird dies, it will become the hauntingly beautiful and sensuous and bittersweet Barber's Adagio for Strings. And another thing I always have to remind myself of is that I am an orchestral conductor, and that greatly influences my taste in music. There are many pieces of great music for string quartet and other chamber music, solo piano, solo violin, concertos for the trombone and orchestra, or for the flute and band, concertos for the French horn and flute accompaniment, operas. There are many, many other genres of music. So much music and so little time. Remember always, if you have any questions or want to comment on anything that I present here, please just drop us a line on our website at lionsgatesinfonia.com. Okay, here we go. Number 1, Antonio Vivaldi, The Four Seasons. Vivaldi lived from 1678 to 1741 and, of course, was Italian. Composed in 1723, The Four Seasons is not only his best-known composition, but it's a work that has become one of the most recognized and popular pieces of music ever written. They are actually 4 concertos for violin and string orchestra with harpsichord that follow the seasons of spring, summer, fall, and winter. By turn, they give us superbly varied textures that take the listener from the festive, sprightly air of spring to the heat and thunderstorms of summer, to hunting and the harvest in autumn, to the icy sleet and snow in winter. There are literally hundreds of recordings of this work, but There's one particular re-release with the Tafelmusik Baroque Orchestra with director Jean Lemon, who stands out as one of the best in the business in my book, and it's a Canadian group. So this is one of those done-to-death works that serious collectors must own. Tafelmusik with Jean Lemon, conductor and violin soloist. Another one of my favorites is the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields with Iona Brown as the conductor and violin soloist. Vivaldi, Four Seasons. In position number 2 is George Friedrich Handel, born in 1685 in Germany, died in 1759 in England. The work, Messiah. Composed in 1741, this is an English-language oratorio, which is words and music, composed by George Friedrich Handel. Funny, German-born, but English composer. There's a scriptural text from the King James Bible that he used. This is perhaps the best-known choral work ever composed. I like having an English orchestra play this with an English choir. Particularly, I love the Academy of Ancient Music and the New College Oxford Choir with Edward Higginbottom, conductor. Coming in number 3, Franz Joseph Haydn, born in 1732 in Austria, died in 1809, also in Austria. His Symphony No. 94, the Surprise Symphony. It was composed in 1791 in London, England. Haydn's music contains tons of jokes and funny little witty twists and turns, and the Surprise Symphony includes probably the most famous joke of all, a sudden fortissimo chord right at the end of an otherwise very delicate and soft piano opening theme in the second movement. The music then returns to its original quiet dynamic as if nothing ever happened. I love an Austrian orchestra for this, especially the Austro-Hungarian Orchestra, Adam Fischer, conductor. The Jupiter Symphony. Mozart lived from 1756 to 1791, born in a small town called Salzburg in Austria, died in Vienna. Composed in 1788, the Jupiter, which was likely so named by an English impresario, Salomon, who also championed the music of Haydn. This was Mozart's last and longest symphony. It is considered to be one of the greatest symphonies in all of classical music. And it's doubtful that Mozart ever even heard it. You know, I sometimes feel like I want to hear an orchestra from the country of the composer's birth. In this case, the Salzburg Mozarteum Orchestra with Hans Graf as conductor. Coming in at number 5, very appropriately, is Beethoven's Fifth. Ludwig van Beethoven lived from 1770 to 1827. He was born in Germany, but did most of his musical career in Austria. He loved Vienna. His Symphony No. 5 was composed between 1804 to 1808. He was already going deaf. This symphony was groundbreaking and is one of the most frequently performed of all musical works. It begins with the very recognizable 3 short notes followed by 1 long note, which is the letter V in Morse code and symbolizes victory in World War II. Beethoven himself is said to have described these notes as symbolic of fate knocking at the door. I love to hear a German orchestra, Berlin Philharmonic, under the great old conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler. Coming in at number 6 now is Antonin Dvorak and his Symphony No. 9, the New World Symphony. Dvorak was born in 1841 in Bohemia, just outside of what we know as Prague, and he died in 1904. It was then called Czechoslovakia. Composed in 1893 while a very homesick maestro, Dvorak was director of the National Conservatory of Music in New York. The New World Symphony depicts sounds of the New World, America. While in the U.S., he encouraged young composers to create their own works based on their own experiences in listening to Native American and African American music, folk music, as it were. One of my favorite performances is by a Slovakian orchestra. I like, for example, the Bratislava Symphony Orchestra with Ondrej Lanard, conductor. You can't have a top 10 list without Tchaikovsky. So at number 7, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, born in 1840, died in 1893, and the piece that I think greatly typifies Tchaikovsky's music is his ballet, The Nutcracker. Composed in 1892, this is arguably the best-known ballet ever created, and certainly the most frequently performed. The full ballet was not an immediate success, though the shorter Nutcracker suite of various movements that Tchaikovsky extracted from the full ballet certainly was very successful and still is today. For the last 50 years, the ballet has become one of Tchaikovsky's most famous compositions over and above his violin concerto, his piano concertos, his symphonies. The Nutcracker. I like a Russian orchestra for this. For example, the Bolshoi Theater Orchestra with Alexander Vedernikov as conductor. Another Russian comes in at number 8. Igor Stravinsky, born 1882, died 1971, and the piece that I love of his is The Rite of Spring. Stravinsky was an unknown young composer when Sergei Diaghilev recruited him to create 3 ballets for the Ballet Russe in Paris. The results were Firebird, Petrushka, and The Rite of Spring, subtitled Pictures of Pagan Russia. The first performance in 1913 of the very avant-garde music and unusual dance movements of Le Sacre du Printemps created a sensation, and riots broke out inside and outside the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. Since then, the music, scored for a huge orchestra, has achieved even greater recognition as one of the most influential compositions of the 20th century. When I was a French horn player, we recorded this with the Montreal Symphony Orchestra. Charles Dutoit was our conductor. Folks, you're not going to believe this, but at number 9 is yet another ballet. Aaron Copland, who was born in New York in 1900, died in 1990, composed several ballets. My favorite one is Appalachian Spring. It was my mother's favorite piece of music, too. Copland was known as the Dean of American Composers. Yes, it was Aaron Copland who created what became known as the American sound, with big and bold music and folk-like melodies, evoking the pioneer spirit and vast landscapes. Composed in 1944 during World War II for the very innovative Martha Graham Dance Company, Appalachian Spring is built on American themes, as requested by Martha Graham herself. Interestingly, Copland very efficiently scored the work for a small group of only 13 players. A year later, he created an orchestral suite for much larger forces. I like to hear an American orchestra play this piece. How about the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra with American conductor Leonard Slatkin? Including our top 10 list is George Gershwin, Rhapsody in Blue. Gershwin was born in 1898 in Brooklyn, New York, to Russian and Lithuanian Jewish parents, originally named Jakub Bruskin Gershowitz. George Gershwin's music easily spanned both classical and popular genres. Originally trained as a classical pianist, he also played and wrote music for Tin Pan Alley, Broadway, and later on Hollywood films, where he died in 1937. His famous Rhapsody in Blue is actually a jazzy and fun piano concerto. I love Ian Parker's performance of this. Here's a great Canadian musician playing a jazzy American piece. Go directly to his website to find Ian Parker as our piano soloist with the London Symphony Orchestra, Michael Francis, conductor. And wrapping up our top 10 list, that was Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. And that wraps up our little Clyde Chat top 10 list. I'm sure I'm going to think of a dozen other pieces that I've left out, but this is a pretty good start. It's an overview of a bunch of really great classical, symphonic pieces of music that I could take to that proverbial desert island, and I could be pretty happy with these. If you have any comments or questions, please drop us a line at lionsgatesinfonia.com. We'd love to hear from you. Next up, I'd like to do a survey of instruments. We'll do an introduction to the members of the four main families of instruments: strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. See you next time at Lionsgate Sinfonia.